My parents sued me for raising me Nell, but they beat me and mistreated me because I am adopted. Hi Reddit. I grew up in a small, forgotten town in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business but never cared enough to intervene. My childhood wasn't filled with warm memories or loving parents. It was the opposite. My adoptive parents, Mark and Linda, never really wanted me. They made that clear from the beginning. They took me in not out of love or kindness, but because of societal pressure. Maybe they wanted to look good in front of their church friends, or maybe they thought having a little charity case would make them seem like better people. I found out I was adopted when I was 5, and it wasn't some heartfelt revelation or a gentle talk about how special I was. No, I found out by accident. I had woken up thirsty in the middle of the night and wandered into the hallway, rubbing my eyes and trying not to trip over my too long pajama pants. That's when I heard them talking in the kitchen. Linda was laughing in that cold, sharp way she did when she was mocking someone, and Mark's voice was low and dismissive. "I don't know why we even bothered," she said. "He's not even ours. I feel nothing for that boy." Mark scoffed. "You're the one who insisted we do it. You thought it'd make us look good. Now we're stuck with him." I stood there frozen, my little hands gripping the edge of the hallway wall. The words didn't make sense at first, but as I listened, I started to understand. I wasn't their real son. I wasn't theirs at all. Something inside me shifted, like a crack running through glass. I wanted to cry, but even at 5, I knew better. I crept back to my bed, curling up under the thin blanket, staring at the ceiling. After that, everything made more sense. The way they looked at me with indifference, the way my mother's touch always felt cold and distant, the way my father barely acknowledged my existence. They weren't my parents. They never wanted to be. They had a real child, Jessica, their perfect daughter. She was 5 years older than me, and to them, she could do no wrong. She got everything: the best clothes, the newest toys, extra dessert at dinner. When she cried, they rushed to comfort her. When she smiled, they beamed with pride. Me? I was just there, an afterthought, a mistake they couldn't return. Jessica knew it too. She treated me like a servant, like an annoyance she had to tolerate. If she broke something, I got blamed. If she wanted something, I was the one forced to give it up. She'd laugh when I got scolded, smirking from behind my mother's skirt while I stood there, small and defenseless, trying to explain myself to people who didn't care. The worst part wasn't the punishments or the neglect. It was the humiliation. Mark and Linda took pleasure in making me feel small. They'd mock me openly, telling me I was lucky to have a roof over my head, lucky they were kind enough to take me in. If I ever dared to ask for something, new shoes, a book, even just a little attention, I was met with sneers and reminders that I should be grateful. "Do you think we owe you anything?" Linda would say, shaking her head in disgust. "You should be thanking us every day for not leaving you where we found you." I learned quickly not to ask, not to hope, not to expect anything. I became invisible, a ghost in my own home. I'd eat in silence, do my chores without complaint, and stay out of their way as much as possible. But no matter how much I tried to disappear, they always found new ways to remind me that I wasn't really part of their family. I still don't know what exactly pushed me over the edge that night. Maybe it was the way my mother sneered at me when I asked for a second helping of dinner. Maybe it was the way my father muttered under his breath about how I was nothing but a burden. Or maybe it was just the unbearable weight of knowing that no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to be good, to be quiet, to be invisible, they would never love me. I was 10 years old when I finally decided I had enough. I packed a small backpack with the only things I had: an old sweatshirt, a bottle of water, and a half-eaten granola bar I had hidden under my bed. I waited until the house was silent, until the only sound was the wind rattling against the windows and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then I slipped out the back door and into the night. I had no plan, no destination, no real idea of what I was doing. I just knew I had to get away. The town was too small to hide in, too empty to offer me anything but the same cold indifference I had always known. I had heard about Chicago, though. I had seen pictures in old magazines at school, the towering buildings, the bright lights, the endless movement. It seemed like a place where someone like me could disappear. So I ran. I ran until my legs burned and my breath came in short, painful gasps. I hitched rides where I could, sneaking into the backs of trucks, hopping onto buses when no one was looking. I barely ate. My stomach ached from hunger, but I told myself it didn't matter. Nothing mattered as long as I got away. When I finally stumbled into the city, exhausted and starving, I was completely unprepared for what I found. Chicago wasn't just big, it was overwhelming. The streets were filled with people who didn't even glance at me as they passed. The buildings loomed over me like giants, and the air was thick with a mix of gasoline, sweat, and something I couldn't quite place. For the first time, I felt truly alone. I wandered for hours, shivering in the cold, my empty stomach twisting painfully. I had no money, no idea where to go. Every alley looked the same, every street blurred together in a maze of noise and motion. I started to panic. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe I had been stupid to think I could survive here on my own. And that's when they found me. Two men, both older, with greasy hair and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They saw me sitting on the curb, rubbing my arms to keep warm, and they approached like they had been waiting for me. "Hey, kid," one of them said, crouching down to my level. "You lost." I didn't answer. Something about them made my skin crawl, but I was too tired, too hungry to move. The other man chuckled. "Bet you're starving, huh? We got food. Warm place to stay. You don't gotta be out here alone." I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone was being kind to me. But something in their eyes, the way they stood too close, the way their hands twitched like they were waiting for the right moment, something was wrong. I shook my head and tried to get up, but the first man grabbed my arm, his grip too tight, his smile widening. "Come on, kid," he said, his voice too smooth, too practiced. "We're just trying to help." Panic surged through me. I yanked my arm back, but his grip tightened. My breath came in short gasps, my chest tightening with fear. I knew I had to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, suddenly, a voice cut through the night. "Hey, get away from him." The men froze, and I turned to see a man standing a few feet away. He was older, maybe mid-30s, with grease-stained hands and a worn leather jacket. His face was hard, serious, and he didn't look like someone you wanted to mess with. The men hesitated for a second, then let go of me. "Mind your business," one of them muttered, but they were already backing away. The man didn't respond. He just watched them until they disappeared into the darkness. Then he turned to me. "You okay, kid?" I nodded, but I could feel myself shaking. My legs felt weak, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You got a place to go?" I shook my head. He exhaled, glancing around like he was debating something. Then he motioned for me to follow. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." I hesitated. I didn't know this man. He could have been just as bad as the others. But something in his voice, the way he had stepped in without hesitation, made me trust him. I followed him. His name was Brian, and he was a mechanic. He worked in a small auto repair shop a few blocks away, a cluttered, greasy place that smelled like oil and metal. He lived in a tiny apartment above it, and that's where he took me. He didn't ask me a million questions, didn't press me for details. He just gave me a plate of food, a real meal, hot and filling, and let me eat in silence. When I finally looked up, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "You running from something?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. He didn't ask what. He just leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You can stay here for a bit," he said. "But if you're gonna be here, you're gonna earn your keep. You help out in the shop. No freeloading." "Got it." I nodded again. I didn't know it then, but that moment would change everything. Living with Brian was nothing like living with Mark and Linda. From the moment I stepped into his small, grease-scented apartment above the shop, I could feel the difference. He didn't talk much at first, just gave me space to exist without demanding anything from me. That alone was something I had never experienced before. There were no insults thrown my way, no constant reminders of how much of a burden I was. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could just breathe. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. I had spent years trying to stay out of sight, trying to make myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. But Brian didn't seem to want that. He expected me to be present, to exist in his space without shame. He made it clear from the start that if I was going to stay, I would have to pull my weight. "You help out in the shop, you go to school, and you don't do anything stupid. You follow those rules, you stay," he said one evening, sitting across from me at the small kitchen table. "Break them, and you're on your own." It wasn't a threat. It was just a fact. I could tell Brian wasn't the kind of man to waste time on empty words. If I wanted this second chance, I had to prove that I deserved it. The first thing he did was help me get my papers sorted. I didn't even know where to start, but he did. He spent days making phone calls, pulling strings, finding ways to get me a new set of documents without too many questions being asked. I never asked him how he knew how to do all that, and he never told me. By the time it was done, I officially existed again. I had an identity, a name, a place to belong, even if it was just on paper. Then came school. Going back to school was one of the hardest things I had to do. I had spent so many years learning that I didn't matter, that no one cared whether I succeeded or failed, that it felt pointless. But Brian didn't give me a choice. He dragged me to the nearest public school, filled out the paperwork, and shoved me through the front doors before I could argue. "You're smart, kid. Don't waste it," he told me that morning before I walked in, his voice gruff but steady. I didn't feel smart. I felt like an outsider, a ghost trying to slip through the cracks. The other kids were nothing like me. They had families, homes, lives that weren't built on running and survival. I kept my head down, kept to myself, but I showed up every day because I knew Brian expected me to. The shop, though, that was different. The first time Brian handed me a wrench, I stared at it like it was something foreign. I had never been allowed to touch anything growing up. In Mark and Linda's house, I wasn't trusted with anything valuable. But Brian didn't hesitate. He tossed me the wrench and pointed at an old beat-up car sitting in the shop. "Take that apart," he said. "Figure out how it works." I didn't know where to start, but I wasn't about to say that. So I crouched down next to the car and started unscrewing bolts, carefully prying pieces apart. Brian watched me, correcting me when I fumbled, showing me how things fit together. He didn't yell when I made mistakes. He just told me to try again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I got better. I learned how to replace brakes, how to fix an engine, how to diagnose problems just by listening to the sounds a car made. Brian was patient but firm, always pushing me to do better. He never gave praise lightly, but when he did, it meant something. "Not bad, kid," he'd say, after I managed to fix something without his help. Those 3 words meant more to me than a lifetime of empty compliments from people who never cared. Over time, something shifted inside me. I stopped feeling like a runaway, like a lost kid with nowhere to go. I started to feel like I belonged. Brian never talked about why he helped me. He never acted like he wanted thanks or recognition. But I could see it in the way he looked at me sometimes, the way he made sure there was always food on the table, the way he taught me how to survive in a world that had never been kind to me. He wasn't just some guy who had picked me up off the street. He was more than that. He was the closest thing I had to a father. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone. Going to college was something I never thought would happen for me. For most of my life, school had been nothing more than a place I was forced to attend, a place where I sat quietly in the back and tried not to draw attention to myself. But Brian had different expectations. He never said I had to go, never forced the idea on me, but he made it clear that I had a choice, a real choice, and that was something I had never been given before. When I got my acceptance letter, I half expected him to brush it off, to tell me that college wasn't necessary, that working at the shop was good enough. Instead, he nodded, patted me on the back, and said, "You earned it. Now don't waste it." So I went. From the moment I stepped on a campus, I knew I didn't belong. The other students carried themselves with an air of confidence, the kind that came from never having to worry about where their next meal was coming from. They had grown up in comfortable houses, driven expensive cars, and spent their summers traveling to places I had only seen in magazines. I was different, and they could tell. It wasn't outright hostility at first, just small things, side glances when I walked into a room, whispered comments when I passed by, casual questions that weren't really questions at all. "Where did you go to high school? What do your parents do? How did you get in?" The last one always came with a smirk, as if they already knew the answer. I ignored it. I had dealt with worse in my life, and I wasn't about to let a bunch of spoiled kids get under my skin. But the more I tried to stay out of their way, the more they seemed determined to remind me that I didn't belong. It all escalated when one of them, a guy named Ryan, decided I was an easy target. Ryan was everything I wasn't: rich, well-connected, effortlessly charismatic. He had a way of making people laugh, even when he was saying something cruel. To him, I was nothing more than an amusement, a joke that he could poke at whenever he was bored. At first, it was just words, comments about my clothes, my background, the way I spoke. Then it turned into something more. One afternoon, I was called into the dean's office. I had no idea why, but as soon as I stepped inside and saw Ryan sitting there with a smug expression on his face, I knew it wasn't going to be good. The dean folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with a disappointed frown. "Alex, we received a report that you were caught cheating on last week's exam." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I had spent hours studying for that test, going over every detail, making sure I understood the material. I had never cheated on anything in my life. "That's not true," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. Ryan leaned back in his chair, a lazy smirk on his face. "Come on, man, just admit it. It's not a big deal. We all know you're not exactly used to this level of work." I clenched my fists under the desk, forcing myself to stay calm. "I didn't cheat," I repeated. "You're lying." The dean sighed, clearly not wanting to deal with this. "We have evidence," he said, sliding a paper across the desk. "This was found under your seat after the exam. It's an exact copy of the answer key." I stared at the paper, my mind racing. I had never seen it before, but I knew exactly what had happened. Someone had planted it. Someone had put it under my seat after the test, knowing it would be found. And I didn't have to guess who that someone was. I looked at Ryan, but he just raised an eyebrow, daring me to say something. I could have panicked. I could have tried to argue, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. Instead, I took a deep breath and thought about what Brian would say. He had always told me that people like Ryan relied on people like me getting scared, backing down, accepting whatever was thrown at them. But I wasn't that person anymore. "Check the security cameras," I said, keeping my voice steady. The dean frowned. "Excuse me." I pointed at the paper. "If that was under my seat, then it was planted there. The exam room has cameras. Check the footage, and you'll see that I never touched it." For a second, Ryan's smirk faltered. Just for a second. The dean hesitated, then picked up his phone. "Wait outside," he said. I walked out, my hands still clenched into fists. Ryan followed a few minutes later, but this time, he didn't look so confident. He didn't say anything as he passed me, but I could tell by the way his jaw was set that he knew he had lost. An hour later, the dean called me back in and told me that I was free to go. They had reviewed the footage, and just as I had said, I had never touched the paper. Someone else had dropped it under my seat when I wasn't looking. The accusation didn't stick, but the damage was done. From that day forward, I knew I was always going to have to prove myself twice as hard, always going to have to be one step ahead of people like Ryan. But that was fine. I had spent my whole life fighting to survive. College wasn't going to be any different. After graduation, I packed my bags and left for New York City with nothing but a degree, a few $100s in my bank account, and the same determination that had carried me through everything else in my life. I had no connections, no safety net, no one waiting for me on the other side. But that didn't scare me. I had learned a long time ago that if I wanted something, I would have to earn it myself. Getting my first job wasn't easy. I applied everywhere: offices, warehouses, mechanic shops, but no one seemed interested in hiring a fresh college graduate with no experience beyond fixing cars in a small shop. Eventually, I landed a job at a construction company, not as an engineer or anything high level, but as a site assistant. It was grunt work, long hours, back-breaking labor, and barely enough pay to cover my rent in a shared apartment on the outskirts of the city. The first few months were brutal. The older workers barely acknowledged me, assuming I wouldn't last. The supervisors didn't expect much either, treating me like just another disposable set of hands. But I didn't complain. I showed up early, stayed late, and paid attention. While the other workers went on their breaks, I watched the foremen, memorizing how they managed projects, how they handled suppliers, how they solved problems when things went wrong. When something needed to be done, I did it without being asked. When no one else wanted to take the worst shifts, I volunteered. Slowly, people started to notice. One of the senior supervisors, a no-nonsense guy named Tony, was the first to take an interest in me. He had been in the industry for decades, and he didn't have time for people who weren't willing to put in the work. But one day, after seeing me stay behind to help an electrician troubleshoot an issue no one else wanted to deal with, he pulled me aside. "You got a good head on your shoulders, kid," he said, eyeing me like he was trying to figure me out. "Ever think about moving up in this business?" I told him I'd move up in anything as long as it paid better. He laughed, then told me to keep showing up early the next week because he was going to teach me things most guys didn't learn until they had been on site for years. That was the beginning. With Tony's guidance, I learned everything I could about construction management, project budgeting, and site logistics. I studied blueprints late at night, took on extra responsibilities, and made sure that when an opportunity came, I was ready. Within 2 years, I was promoted to a site coordinator. A year after that, I moved into project management. The money got better, the apartments got nicer, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to count every dollar before spending it. I never became famous, never built some massive empire or got my name in magazines, but I didn't care about that. I was comfortable. I had more than enough to live well, to travel when I wanted, to save up for the future. I had built something for myself, something no one could take away from me. And most importantly, I had proved to myself that I didn't need to be born into money or privilege to make it. All I had ever needed was the chance to fight for it. After years of working my way up in the construction industry, I came to a realization that had been creeping up on me for a long time. I didn't want to spend my life making money for someone else. I had learned everything there was to know about the business, from managing projects to dealing with clients, from handling suppliers to solving problems on site. I knew how to run things better than some of the people above me, and more importantly, I knew that if I wanted real freedom, I had to build something of my own. That was when I started talking seriously with David, a colleague I had met on one of my early projects. He had the same drive I did, the same hunger to do more than just work a steady job until retirement. We had always talked about starting something of our own, but we had never had the capital or the right timing. One night, over drinks in a cramped bar in Brooklyn, we decided to stop talking and start acting. We pooled our savings, which wasn't much, took out a risky loan, and registered our own construction company. It wasn't anything impressive at first, Just two guys with experience, a business license, and a willingness to take whatever jobs we could find. We didn't have big contracts or wealthy investors backing us. We started with small renovation projects, barely scraping by, doing most of the work ourselves because we couldn't afford to hire a full team. The first year was brutal. There were months when we didn't know if we could keep the company afloat, when paying rent on our tiny office space felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. We had to fight for every contract, convince clients to trust us over bigger, more established firms, and deal with suppliers who charged us higher rates because we didn't have a history with them. More than once, I lay awake at night wondering if we had made a mistake, if I had risked everything just to fail. But we didn't quit. We made smart choices. Instead of trying to compete with massive companies right away, we focused on projects they ignored, smaller residential builds, custom renovations, and commercial spaces that needed quick turnarounds. We built a reputation for reliability, for getting things done on time and within budget, for treating clients like partners instead of just paychecks. Word spread. Then came the breakthrough. A real estate developer, someone we had done a few small jobs for, took a chance on us with a larger project, a mid-sized apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. It was our first major contract, our first chance to prove that we could handle something on that scale. We poured everything we had into that project, working long hours, making sure every detail was perfect, personally overseeing everything from foundation to finishing touches. When it was done, the developer was impressed, and more importantly, he told people about us. That contract led to another, and another. We reinvested every dollar we made back into the business. We hired more workers, expanded our operations, and secured better deals with suppliers. Within a few years, we weren't just another small firm trying to survive. We had become one of the most respected mid-sized construction companies in the city. I never became a celebrity, never ended up on magazine covers or in flashy interviews, but that had never been my goal. What mattered was that I had built something real. I had gone from a runaway kid with nothing to a man who owned a multi-million-dollar company, a man who could walk into any room and be respected not because of where he came from, but because of what he had achieved. I wasn't just making a living anymore. I was building a legacy. The call came on a quiet afternoon when I was sitting in my office, going over project estimates for a new development. My company had just landed another big contract, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The business was thriving, my life was stable, and the years of struggle were finally paying off. I had put my past behind me, or at least I thought I had, until I saw the unfamiliar number flashing on my phone. Something in my gut told me not to answer, but I picked up anyway. The moment I heard her voice, a chill ran down my spine. It had been almost 2 decades since I had last spoken to Linda, and yet the sound of her was exactly the same, cold, sharp, calculated. "Alex," she said, drawing out my name as if we were old friends. "It's been so long." I didn't say anything at first, just sat there gripping the phone, waiting for her to get to the point. She had never called me before, not when I was struggling, not when I was a lost kid trying to find my place in the world. If she was reaching out now, there was a reason, and I already had a feeling it had nothing to do with genuine concern. "I've been hearing things about you," she continued, her voice unervingly smooth. "Successful business, making a name for yourself. I always knew you'd do well. We raised you right, after all." A bitter laugh almost slipped out of me, but I caught it just in time. The audacity of it was almost impressive. "What do you want, Linda?" I asked, cutting through whatever performance she was putting on. There was a pause on the other end, a beat of silence where I imagined her weighing how to frame her next words. Then she sighed, as if this was all so difficult for her. "Things haven't been easy for us," she said. "Mark's been sick, and medical bills are piling up. We're struggling, Alex, and we could really use your help. After everything we did for you, we thought you'd be willing to support your family." That word, family, made my jaw clench. I could feel my pulse quicken, old anger rising to the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You want money," I said, stating it plainly. She didn't even try to deny it. "You owe us, Alex," she said, her voice turning sharper, as if she had finally dropped the act. "We fed you, clothed you, gave you a home when we didn't have to. You wouldn't be where you are if it weren't for us." I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of my desk. For years, I had wondered what I would say if this moment ever came. If the people who had spent my childhood making me feel like nothing ever tried to crawl back into my life. Now that it was happening, I realized I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt nothing at all. "You didn't raise me," I said, my voice steady. "You tolerated me. You reminded me every single day that I was unwanted. You made it clear that I was never part of your family, and now you want me to pretend that I owe you something. You're being ungrateful," she snapped, her voice laced with irritation now that her manipulation wasn't working. We took you in when no one else would. If it weren't for us, you'd be nothing. The least you can do is pay us back for the years we spent taking care of you." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "I don't owe you a damn thing, Linda." "You selfish little," she started, but I didn't let her finish. I ended the call, tossed my phone onto the desk, and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For a few minutes, I just sat there, letting the weight of the moment settle in. I had spent so many years trying to prove that I was more than what they had made me believe I was. But now, hearing her voice, hearing the entitlement dripping from every word she spoke, I realized something important. I had already won. They had tried to break me, tried to make me feel like I was worthless, and yet here I was, standing on my own, successful, free, and completely untethered from them. They had no power over me anymore. I picked up my phone, blocked the number, and went back to work. There was nothing left to say. The lawsuit arrived in a thick envelope, stamped and official, as if it were just another business matter instead of the absurdity that it was. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, some kind of joke, but as I flipped through the pages, I realized that Linda and Mark were truly serious. They were suing me for financial compensation, claiming that after raising me, I owed them support in their old age. They had twisted every piece of my childhood into a narrative where they were the selfless, devoted parents who had sacrificed everything for me. Reading through their claims, I felt something close to amusement, but mostly, I felt disgust. They spoke about how they had given me shelter, how they had provided food and clothing, how they had guided me into becoming the man I was today. They didn't mention the years of neglect, the cold indifference, the punishments that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with cruelty. They didn't mention the times I had gone to bed hungry because they decided I didn't deserve to eat, or the words they had thrown at me that cut deeper than any bruise ever could. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I called my lawyer, a man I had worked with in the past, someone sharp, relentless, and completely uninterested in anything other than winning. When I told him about the case, he let out a low whistle and said, "They really think they have a shot at this?" "They don't," I said, my voice firm. "Make sure they know it." And that's exactly what he did. We built our case carefully, gathering every scrap of evidence we could find. I had no photos of the bruises, no written confessions of the things they had done, but I had something just as powerful, memories from people who had been there. Teachers who had seen me come to school in clothes that were too small, neighbors who had heard the shouting through the walls, old classmates who remembered the way my sister had treated me like a servant while my parents looked on with approval. Then there was Brian. He had known me when I was just a scared kid on the streets, barely 10 years old and running from a life I couldn't bear anymore. He had seen the aftermath of what they had done to me, had taken me in when they wouldn't even look for me. His testimony was solid, his words carrying the weight of someone who had nothing to gain from lying. When we presented our evidence in court, Linda and Mark tried to keep up their act, playing the part of the heartbroken parents betrayed by an ungrateful son. They spoke about sacrifice, about love, about duty. But when my lawyer laid out the truth, when witness after witness stepped forward to confirm what they had done to me, their carefully built illusion started to crumble. The moment that sealed it was when my lawyer asked Linda a simple question. "If you loved your son so much, if you were truly devoted parents, then why did you never report him missing when he ran away at 10 years old?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating, until she finally managed to say, "We thought he would come back." My lawyer didn't even need to respond. The damage had been done. The judge ruled in my favor without hesitation. Not only were their claims dismissed, but the court ordered them to pay me compensation for the emotional and psychological damage they had inflicted. It wasn't a massive amount, not something that would change my life, but that wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time, they were the ones facing consequences. When the ruling was read, I didn't look at them. I didn't need to see their expressions to know what they were feeling. Their plan had backfired spectacularly, and now, instead of taking from me, they were being forced to give. I walked out of that courtroom feeling lighter than I had in years. I had spent so much of my life carrying the weight of what they had done, but now, for the first time, I was free. The lawsuit should have been the end of it. I had thought that after losing in court, after being humiliated in front of a judge and forced to pay me instead of the other way around, Linda and Mark would finally disappear from my life. I should have known better. At first, there was silence. No calls, no messages, no further legal threats. I had almost started to believe that they had given up, that they had finally accepted defeat. But then the small signs started appearing. My mail was tampered with, though nothing was ever taken. I noticed a car idling near my office on more than one occasion, always in the same spot, the driver never stepping out. And then, late one evening, I saw her. Linda stood across the street from my apartment building, her figure barely visible under the dim streetlights. She wasn't moving, wasn't even pretending to be there for any other reason. She was just standing there, staring up at my window, as if she could burn a hole through the glass with her hatred alone. I didn't call the police. Maybe I should have, but part of me thought she would eventually tire herself out. After all, what more could she do? She had already lost in court, had already been forced to acknowledge, in front of everyone, that I wasn't hers to control anymore. What else was there? I got my answer a week later. It was late, well past midnight, when I stepped out of my car and headed toward my building. The streets were mostly empty, the city quieter than usual. I barely had time to register the sound of rushed footsteps before something sharp, something cold, sliced into my arm. Pain shot through me, sharp and immediate, and as I stumbled back, I saw her. Linda's face was twisted, her eyes wild with fury, her hair disheveled, as if she hadn't slept in days. She was gripping a knife, her knuckles white from how tightly she was holding it. "You ruined us," she screamed, her voice shrill, unhinged. "You took everything, you ungrateful little bastard. We gave you a home, and this is how you repay us." Blood dripped down my arm, warm and sticky, but I barely felt it. My entire body had gone into survival mode, my mind racing through a million thoughts at once. She wasn't just angry. She was completely unhinged, lost in whatever twisted reality she had created in her mind. She lunged at me again, the knife glinting under the streetlights, but before she could reach me, a blur of motion knocked her to the ground. Brian. I hadn't even seen him arrive, but there he was, pinning her down with the kind of strength that came from years of hard labor. Linda thrashed beneath him, screaming obscenities, cursing me, cursing him, cursing everything. Brian didn't say a word. His face was calm, his movements controlled, as he grabbed his phone with one hand and dialed the police. "They'll be here in a few minutes," he said, his voice steady. "Stay down, lady, or I'll make sure you regret it." Linda continued to scream, her fury spilling out in incoherent rants, but she wasn't going anywhere. Brian had her locked in place, and within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights flooded the street. The police pulled her off the ground, cuffed her wrists, and dragged her toward the waiting car. She fought them the whole way, still shouting, still convinced that she was the victim in all of this. As they shoved her inside, she turned to look at me one last time, her eyes burning with hatred. "This is your fault," she spat. "You'll regret this. You'll always regret this." I didn't respond. I just watched as the door slammed shut and the car pulled away. Brian let out a breath, rubbing his face before looking at me. "You okay?" I glanced down at my arm, at the blood staining my sleeve, and let out a slow exhale. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." Linda was sentenced to several years in prison for attempted murder and aggravated assault. Mark, unsurprisingly, didn't even try to defend her. He had disappeared the moment things got difficult, proving once again that he had only ever cared about himself. As for me, I moved on. I had spent too much of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with me. But now, finally, it was over. Linda was gone, Mark was out of the picture, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free. The days following the attack felt strangely quiet, as if the world had taken a deep breath and finally exhaled. Linda was gone, locked away in a prison cell where she could no longer reach me, no longer haunt the life I had built. Mark had vanished, disappearing into whatever hole he crawled into when things got difficult. For the first time, there was no lingering shadow from my past, no weight pressing down on me, no unfinished business waiting to be settled. It was over. I healed, both physically and in ways I hadn't realized I needed to. The wound on my arm faded into a scar, a small reminder of the night everything finally came to a close. But more than that, I felt something inside me shift, something I hadn't known I was still holding on to. The fear, the resentment, the anger I had carried for so long, none of it mattered anymore. Linda and Mark had spent years trying to convince me that I was nothing without them, that I owed them my life. But standing in my office, looking over the city from the window of the company I built with my own two hands, I knew the truth. I had made myself. Everything I had accomplished, had come from my own determination, my own resilience. No one had handed me anything. No one had paved the way for me. I had fought for every inch of my success, and no one, not Linda, not Mark, not anyone, could take that away from me. Brian, as always, stayed by my side. He didn't make a big deal about it, didn't smother me with unnecessary concern, but he was there in the way he had always been. When I got out of the hospital, he was the one who drove me home, shaking his head and muttering about how I had a bad habit of attracting trouble. When I went back to work, he showed up at my office with coffee, sitting across from me as if nothing had changed, as if we weren't both thinking about how close things had come to ending differently. You know, he said one day, leaning back in his chair as he watched me go through blueprints for our next project. Most people don't get to walk away from the kind of past you had. They either let it drag them down, or they spend their whole life running from it. I set the papers down and looked at him. I'm not running anymore. He nodded, as if he already knew. Life didn't become perfect overnight, but it was mine. I continued to build my business, taking on bigger projects, making smarter investments, securing my place in an industry that had once felt impossible to break into. I traveled when I wanted, lived comfortably, surrounded myself with people who actually cared. I didn't need revenge, didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The best thing I could do, the only thing that really mattered, was to live my life on my own terms. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was living, and that was more than enough.